Hey folks, how's everybody out there doing? Thanks for being here. I have another amazing guest for you. Jerry Condon, the co-founder of Veterans for Peace. Hopefully all of you already know Veterans for Peace. I think most of you probably do. They're at every anti-war protest and the like that you, I think, have ever seen across the nation. They do amazing work beyond just that. But yeah, that's one of the main reasons I'm so excited to talk to Jerry today. Please hit subscribe, everybody. Click the thumbs up, leave a comment. I will be featuring as many comments as we can get to, or the moderator will, or we'll be throwing them onto the screen. Even if we don't get a chance to address them, we'll be throwing them up there anyway. And thank you so much for being here. So please share this, and let's dive into this interview with truly an amazing guest, Jerry Condon. Hello.
Thank you, Lee. It's St. Patrick's Day, so I'm wearing my kind of St. Patrick's version of the Veterans for Peace t-shirt. It was designed by the late George Johnson in honor of our Irish chapter of Veterans for Peace.
I like it. I like it. Do you have a Veterans for Peace shirt for every holiday, or just St. Patrick's Day?
Pretty much.
It is great to talk with you again. I hope you're doing wonderful. We can talk more about it later, but we are doing this on the cusp, the day before a major anti-war rally that you guys will be a part of. And I suppose that's a good way to start, is tell us about this anti-war rally happening tomorrow.
Well, it's great. Yeah, I'm here in DC now getting ready. We're forming a veterans and GI contingent, Veterans for Peace, About Face Veterans Against the War, and others. And we're looking forward to it tomorrow. There's a lot of outrage about the continuing war in Ukraine and the U.S. escalation of that war. And to the point where, as many people say, and I think it's all too true, this is like the perfect scenario for World War III and nuclear war. And yet the neocons are charging ahead as if that was not a danger at all. They're putting the entire world at risk. And of course, there's a lot of confusion about this war because, after all, it was Russia that seemed to be the aggressor. If you go back 1 year and see the Russian tanks rolling into Ukraine. But of course, many of us realize that this war has been going on much longer than that, at least as far back as 2014, and that the U.S. and NATO created this war scenario and now seem to be wanting to continue to wage a proxy war against Russia to destroy Russia or to force regime change there, eventually to weaken Russia and to even partition Russia, to make it more easy for U.S. and multinational corporations access to Russian resources, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, it's an outrage. There's a lot of confusion about it, even in the U.S. peace and anti-war circles.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about that. It's a difficult conversation to have with, friends and family and those who are liberal and think they stand for peace by waving a Ukrainian flag. They don't seem to understand the entirety of what we're facing here. But I would imagine even within, and people I've talked to, I know, even within anti-war movements, there are people who say, oh, I'm anti-war, but that means you've got to be just pro-Ukraine right now. And they end the thought process at that.
Absolutely. And, it's hard to engage them because you start to talk about the history and how the U.S. is forcing regime change and trying to, in many different countries around the world, how they succeeded in forcing regime change in Ukraine in 2014 and have, backed military aggression against Ukrainians in the eastern part of Ukraine. People just don't want to hear that. They kind of get locked into their, Russia bad. If we opposed U.S. invasion of Iraq, we have to oppose the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and calling for negotiations to end the war, ceasefire negotiations to end the war, which is really the only sane practical path towards peace at this point is not the same thing as cheerleading for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There's a lot of different opinions about that too. Many people say that Russia had no choice. And Veterans for Peace, we like to think there are always other choices than going to war. The war is not the answer. But we realize that our own government has its hands, fingerprints all over this war, and is blocking the path towards negotiations while continuing to escalate the war. So our responsibility here in the U.S., according to the Veterans for Peace Principles of Unity, will restrain our government from intervening overtly and covertly in the internal affairs of other nations, and it's certainly doing that in Ukraine. So anyway, the march and rally tomorrow is very welcome. A lot of different groups have come together. Answer Coalition, Code Pink, People's Forum, United National Anti-War Coalition, Veterans for Peace, Black Alliance for Peace, and actually over 200. Peace and Justice will be pretty good size here in Washington, D.C., even though it's been all mobilized in about 3 weeks. But there's also companion actions being called around the country, at least a dozen U.S. cities tomorrow. So that's good. And there's a wide range of demands for peace in Ukraine, for an end to endless wars, for the U.S. Withdrawing troops from Africa and the Middle East. The veterans contingent is, of course, calling on GIs to refuse to fight wars for the military-industrial complex. We're also calling for reparations for Iraq and Afghanistan and Yemen and Syria. And we're calling for not only for peace abroad, but peace at home. We want an end to police violence, and we want an end to the war on Black America, which is kind of the other side of the coin of U.S. militarization.
All great demands, all wonderful things to be speaking about. I truly hope that anyone who can make it to one of these protests attend and get something out of it and be a part of it. You get more information at answercoalition.org, or I imagine Veterans for Peace probably also has information on your site.
That's right.
You talked about, sorry, go ahead.
Veteransforpeace.org.
You talked about calling on GIs to refuse. I think that now would be at that point would be a good time to explain your story to people who don't know, because I think a lot of people know Veterans for Peace. They may not know your personal story.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I joined the Army in 1967 under pressure from the draft. I wasn't really gung-ho. I wouldn't have gone otherwise without the draft. And I ended up training as a Special Forces medic. Kept me in the training for quite a long time. So I had a chance to think about things, and I had like serious doubts about the war even before I went in the Army. And they were just reinforced by the training I had, actually, even the basic training. I mean, there was so much sexism and especially racism that was just blatant in our training. I mean, we were running around with our rifles at bay yelling, "Kill the gooks, kill the gooks," and that chant was being led by a black drill sergeant, which kind of had my head spinning. But I kept on pushing forward and went through the various trainings and went through airborne training, and then initial special forces training, and then my specialty, the medic training for special forces is a year long in itself, because they have to make kind of a jungle doctor out of you. So I had a chance to talk to returning veterans and hear from some of my friends who had already deployed to Vietnam. And I was hearing stories about these atrocities against civilians. And, some of the veterans were very remorseful. They were horrified by what they had seen, but others were actually bragging about it, but they were both telling the same story, just really atrocious stuff. And at that point I said, okay, that's it. I cannot go ahead with this, I started to speak out against the war and to refuse orders. I was eventually given orders for Vietnam, which I refused. And then I was court-martialed and actually sentenced to 10 years in prison and a dishonorable discharge for refusing 2 orders to deploy to Vietnam. And but by that time, and part of the reason the sentence was so high was they were pissed off because I'd already escaped from Fort Bragg and headed to Canada. And then from Canada, I went to Europe and eventually to Sweden. I spent 3 years in Sweden working with the American Deserters Committee there. Sweden was the only country to actually give us formal asylum because we were refusing to participate in an illegal war. And there were about only 800 of us that went to Sweden, though. And whereas there was between 60 and 100,000 came to Canada, draft resistors and deserters. And in fact, 30,000 of those remain in Canada and are Canadian citizens today. Well, I came back and worked also in Canada, in Vancouver and Toronto with Amex Canada Collective, not only opposing the war, but also fighting for amnesty for all war resistors. And I came back in 1975 after 6 years abroad in exile as part of a campaign for amnesty. And eventually my jail sentence was totally dropped. I never did a day in jail. But as I like to say, I've been a prisoner of the anti-war movement ever since. I haven't been able to get off that track. So I've been very active. Even before Veterans for Peace was founded in 1985, I helped organize the first 2 veterans delegations to revolutionary Nicaragua and have maintained connections with Nicaragua. In fact, led a VFP delegation to Nicaragua again in 2019 to learn about the U.S. regime change attempts going on there and to fight back against all the lies. There's so many lies, Lee. You know how it is. You could spend all day and all night, and you wouldn't even be hardly dealing with the tip of the iceberg. But that's what the value of veterans. Veterans are suffer from a great sense of betrayal, and we have been lied to so much by our political leaders, sometimes by our religious leaders, and certainly by the mainstream media, and lied into a lot of wars that we regret. So we have, many of us feel a great responsibility to set the record straight and to educate the younger GIs today that's not in their interest to fight in wars. They're basically the poor and working class people who are expendable pawns on the rich man's chessboard. And that's really the case for Ukraine as well, although it's harder to see that. And it is a very complex war. Some people say, I think Ted Snyder says, it's 4 wars in one. So there's a lot of different ways you can look at that war. But the way that I look at it is it's obviously U.S. imperialism trying to maintain and even expand their influence in Europe at the expense of Russia.
Yeah, and I think in terms of how is it a rich man's war, which I think you said it is very confusing for folks, but there's multiple ways. I mean, yes, there are billions made in weapons contracts, and the U.S. empire, our economy is now military based or war based, and we have to keep war going. So we have to keep the $1 trillion a year pumped into military contractors. But in a larger sense, it is the U.S. fearing a loss of hegemony and wanting to shut off Russia from Europe, put Europe back into a vassal state position. And some of that has been a success in this proxy war. Some of it has been a grand failure in that Russia's economy is not struggling and it's solidified ties with China. So, we got some of the things that the U.S. government wanted and some of the things they didn't. But in the meantime, of course, thousands of Ukrainians die, millions of refugees, and the U.S. empire doesn't care.
Right. Well, and there's hundreds of soldiers on both sides that are reportedly dying every day right now, and some of the estimates are as high as 100,000 casualties on both sides. It's hard to know exactly what the facts really are, but we know it's horrendous. And the fighting that's going on around Bakhmut right now, it's like been described as kind of like the trench warfare of World War I. I mean, just horrible, with mass casualties and both sides just suffering greatly. All the relatively young men, because I guess Ukraine is drafting people all the way up into their 50s and 60s. And I'm not sure what the age range is for the Russian soldiers, but way too many soldiers dying for a war that never had to happen, in a war that could be ended. And then you mentioned China. I mean, in the background here is that the U.S. is gearing up for a war against China, and they're putting all the pieces in place. And even part of the rationale for the thinking of the neocons in this country about the war in Ukraine is that if we weaken Russia, then we'll have an easier time going after China. And they're trying to create the same kind of conflict and contradictions and fight in Taiwan as they have done in Ukraine, to use that as a way to have an excuse to go to war against China. Now, what's China done to deserve that? They have a tremendously successful economic progress. They've taken up millions and millions of people out of poverty, and now they have an economy that's so successful that they're equivalent with, and maybe soon surpassing, U.S. economic strength. And the only way that the U.S. neocons can figure out how to deal with that is to go to war with China and beat them back a few decades. So they're setting the stage for that, and I think we need to be very concerned about that. I mean, just the incredibly aggressive and reckless policies, putting the whole world at risk of nuclear war so that they can hang on to their global superiority and hegemony. I think they'd be much wiser to kind of adjust to the fact that we now have a multipolar world, and they're not going to be the unchallenged big dog in every region of the world.
We've seen a decrease in the bowing down to American hegemony recently. 80%, over 80% of the world's population is in countries that either support Russia or at least have not signed on to the U.S. sanctions, meaning they're not caving to U.S. pressure to sign on to the sanctions. And on top of that, you see other areas that U.S. power has waned, such as the détente that was just signed between Saudi Arabia and Iran, mediated by China. That was a seismic shift that just happened there. Do you feel, and of course I know the answer, but I want to hear you talk about it. Do you feel that the U.S. Losing this, or at least the power of the U.S. waning globally, to bend countries to its will, is that a positive for peace?
Yes, I mean, I think multilateralism makes sense. Getting rid of a country that's or reducing the power of the United States to have its way, whether it's militarily or using its economic power to wage economic war, so-called sanctions against about a third of the world's population at this point, it's a very good thing. In some ways, maybe the war in Ukraine is actually accelerating some of these changes. You could say that might be the silver lining on this cloud, but I'm still extremely disturbed that this war is just going to get worse and worse. And it could really lead to World War III. But in the meantime, yeah, there are some positive developments, and obviously the world relations are realigning, and people are wanting to develop relationships that are based on mutual interest and mutual respect, and equal trading terms, and that's a very good thing, and it's exciting, actually. I'm just, as I said, hoping we'll survive this current situation in Ukraine, which I think could easily get out of control. There, I mean, occasionally we hear rumors that there's some kind of back channel negotiations going on, maybe that all sides are realizing that they're not going to be able to improve their battlefield position, and that would create a time that would be ripe for ceasefire and negotiations. But they've already missed so many opportunities for that, and how many more will they miss? You know, we had the incident with the Russian Russian fighter. These kind of things can be amplified and escalated, or just lead to an accidental escalation that where nuclear weapons could actually be used. And even without nuclear weapons, a conventional war that would be a wider war in Europe, not in Europe's interest. And Europe is Europe is seriously damaging, and yet and we have 50,000 people in the streets of Berlin a week or so back calling for an end to German collaboration with the U.S. proxy war. But at the same time, it seems like the European countries have been very much bowing down to U.S. demands. And then now we have Sweden and Finland who've applied for membership in NATO. We have a lot of the European countries sending weapons to Ukraine. I guess yesterday Poland was the first to actually say they're going to send fighter aircraft to Ukraine. Several other countries say they may follow suit. So there's a lot of indications that people are not looking at ending this war in a couple months, but they're actually looking on extending this war for years.
Talk a little about the precedent that according to Seymour Hersh's revelations and well-researched article, well-researched investigation, that the precedent it sets for the U.S. to have blown up the Nord Stream pipeline with a country that we're supposedly not at war with. There's no declared war between the U.S. and Russia. And the precedent that sets for to take out another country's infrastructure that you're supposedly not at war with.
Yeah, well, the neocons think that they can do anything and not suffer any consequences and get away with it, and so far they are getting away with it. I mean, even Germany, who must know, the German authorities must know who's behind this, are refusing to call them out. Sweden doesn't want to release the information of its own investigation of what happened. Norway, according to Seymour Hersh's article, was actually actively participated in this action to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline. So once again, Europe, aside from, instead of charting an independent course for itself, seems to be more subservient to U.S. strategy than ever before, and very reluctant to speak up against what the U.S. is doing. And that's really quite ominous. I mean, the neocons consider that a big victory, that NATO could be stronger than ever from their perspective. But this war is not over yet, and I think we may be in for a few surprises. The U.S. may be in for a few surprises. I just hope we're not all in for a horrible surprise.
Yeah, speaking of pushing us closer and closer to nuclear war, can you talk a little about the Veterans for Peace, nuclear protocol stance?
Sure. Well, one of the founding principles of Veterans for Peace is to reduce and eventually eliminate all nuclear weapons. And we have actually strengthened our resolve in that regard. We formed a nuclear abolition working group that's been very, very active in the last couple of years, and speaking out and writing letters to Biden and supporting the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And then we were actively waiting for President Biden to release his own nuclear posture review. Ever since the Clinton administration, it's become customary for the new president to release a nuclear posture review publicly to the world, say, well, this is where we stand. This is what our policy is. These are the circumstances under which we might use nuclear weapons, etc. There were some rumors that, actually Biden himself had indicated when he was campaigning that he might implement a no first use policy of nuclear weapons. So we were looking for that. Well, we waited, and it was, I think, a year and a half or more into Biden's administration. There was still no nuclear posture review. So we talked about this, and we said, well, maybe Veterans for Peace should issue its own nuclear posture review. So we did. We got busy and doing our research. We had a number of people who were very, very well informed about the history of nuclear weapons policy in the U.S. And so we put together our own Veterans for Peace nuclear posture review and released that last year. And it's still getting a lot of notice. And we're going to actually, when the Golden Rule Peace Boat is in Washington, D.C. in a couple of weeks, we're going to be delivering that nuclear posture review to every single member of Congress. What it calls for, basically, it reviews the U.S. policy towards all the other nuclear powers. There are 9 nuclear powers, and then it calls for a series of steps that would reduce the risk of nuclear war and ultimately get rid of all nuclear weapons. We have we call for announcing implementing a no first use policy and a no launch on warning policy, taking weapons off hair trigger alert, decommissioning the ICBM weapons, replacing the president's sole authority to launch a nuclear attack. You know, that people became a little bit more nervous than usual about this under the Trump administration. But for any president, a single individual, to be able to make that decision to launch a potentially civilization-ending nuclear war doesn't make any sense at all. We call for the U.S. to sign and ratify the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but also to honor the treaties that's already signed. I mean, George Bush and Trump basically tore up a bunch of treaties that already, and now the one remaining treaty, the START treaty between the U.S. and Russia, has been suspended by Russia because how can you have a mutual trust and mutual inspections of each other's nuclear weapons in the middle of a war in which the U.S. is basically trying to dismember Russia? So all of these safeguards, these against nuclear war, have been taken off the table, and we're at a greater risk than ever before. So at any rate, that's the U.S. That's the Veterans for Peace position, and it's actually a very comprehensive document, and it's very put together really nicely with a lot of good graphics and graphs, and I highly recommend people to check that out. That can find it on the Veterans for Peace website, Veterans for Peace Nuclear Posture Review. But I should point out that the nuclear disarmament movement often fails to recognize the aggressive military posture around the world of the United States. As long as in our nuclear posture review, we make it clear that as long as the U.S. powers that be continue to try to maintain hegemony around the world, as long as we have 850 military bases all over the globe and several wars going on at once, and then more wars being planned, there's not going to be any serious moves towards nuclear disarmament. So we have to fight against imperialism at the same time that we're fighting for nuclear disarmament, because certainly imperialism and nuclear weapons go hand in hand as far as the U.S. is concerned.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is terrifying that they'd be willing to put us all at risk so that they can achieve their ends. But of course, that's only if nuclear war doesn't accidentally break out as they're doing these things, as they're taking out the Nord Stream pipeline or pushing for a proxy war, et cetera,
right.
You know, instigating against China.
It's interesting that a lot of people are accusing Putin, and it keeps on being repeated over and over and over again in the mainstream media, that Putin has threatened and is threatening nuclear war, and he's trying to hold everybody nuclear hostage. Well, some of his statements can be interpreted as latent threats. I mean, he's reminded people what the nuclear situation is and how this could use, under the current circumstances and the nuclear policies of both the U.S. and Russia, how this war could easily lead to nuclear war. So I think that's a warning that we all should heed. Whether it's actually a threat is another question, but that's the way it's portrayed in the U.S. media and by U.S. leaders. Well, you know, the U.S. has nuclear weapons stored in 5 or 6 different European countries, and has torn up all these nuclear treaties, has moved nuclear weapons close to the U.S., to Russia's borders. So who's threatening whom?
Yeah, I always try and say, to people that don't seem to understand it, how would the U.S. respond if Russia had nuclear weapons and missiles on the border in Mexico and then helped create and fund a Nazi coup of Mexico, and then Mexico signed an agreement, a militarized agreement with Russia? I don't think the U.S. would respond very well.
Yeah, and that should be an effective argument, but it's amazing. A lot of people just don't want to hear it. There's a lot of stubborn refusal to see this war for what it is. Yeah.
Let's talk a little about the Golden Rule peace boat. It's just a really cool, I guess we can call it a project that you guys have been doing for a long time now, and it gets media and people love it, and so I'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah, this is really an amazing story. Veterans for Peace owns now this historic anti-nuclear sailboat. It's a 34-foot classic wooden sailboat that was built between 1956 and 1958 in Costa Rica. It was purchased in 1958 by some Quaker peace activists who've been organizing for nuclear disarmament, actually specifically organizing against U.S. bomb testing in the Marshall Islands. The U.S. had dropped 67 bombs, exploded 67 nuclear devices in the Marshall Islands,
right,
from during the late 40s through 1958. So these 4 Quaker peace activists, led by a recently retired World War II Navy commander, Albert Bigelow, purchased this boat, and they decided to sail it out of San Pedro Harbor in Los Angeles and head to the Marshall Islands, and in this bold direct action to sail right into the nuclear test zone to try to stop the nuclear testing, or at least bring worldwide attention to it. So they publicized their intentions, and they headed out of LA. Actually, they ran into a horrible storm that forced them back to LA after a couple of days. And one of the crew members was so sick he had to leave, and they've recruited someone to replace him. They headed out again. They made it as far as Honolulu, which is a significant voyage, and there they stopped to refuel and resupply, but when they headed back out towards the Marshall Islands, which is another 4,000 miles, they were stopped by the U.S. Coast Guard. The National Atomic Energy Commission, which had put out a rule, which was actually referred to as the Golden Rule, to keep them from sailing into the test zone, making it illegal to do so. Turned out that was totally unconstitutional, but it was what they were acting on at the time. So the crew members made a second attempt to leave Hawaii, and were once again brought back. They made it out into international waters, but they were still pulled back in by the Coast Guard, thrown in jail for 60 days. One of the crew members was Jim Peck, actually got tuberculosis while he was in the Honolulu jail. And he and Albert Bigelow, the captain, by the way, were later on freedom riders, civil rights freedom riders, and were on the bus with John Lewis when they were all attacked and beaten. That's a whole other story. At any rate, they went on trial, and then there was a second boat that came into Honolulu Harbor at that time, the Phoenix of Hiroshima, and captained by Earl Reynolds, who was a U.S. military, a medical researcher who'd actually been assigned by the U.S. to study the effects of radiation on children in Hiroshima after the bombing. And his research was so highly classified that he couldn't access it himself. And he and his family were sailing around the world with several Hiroshima crewmen on board, and just happened to park their boat right down a couple slips away from the Golden Rule. They met the crew. They went to the trial. They were so inspired by these guys. They had a family meeting because Earl had his wife with him, his 19-year-old son, his 14-year-old daughter, and a cat, and 2 Japanese crew. And they had a meeting, and they decided. Sorry about that. They decided they were going to sail into the test zone, and they did. And he was also arrested and on trial in Honolulu for 2 years, and convicted, but eventually appealed and won because the rule was unconstitutional. You can't tell people they can't sail into international waters. But at any rate, their ordeal and their trial and the bold action brought worldwide attention to radiation that was floating all around the globe at the time from all this nuclear testing. And it led to the 1963 partial ban treaty that was signed by President Kennedy and the leaders of the UK and the USSR. It also led to the founding of Greenpeace. Greenpeace's very first action was to buy a boat and to sail it into a nuclear test zone up in Alaska. So the boat was sold, went into private hands. 3 or 4 different families sailed it in the South Seas and the Caribbean for several years. And then somehow or other, it ended up a derelict boat in Humboldt Bay, Northern California. And it sunk with a big hole in its side, and it was dragged out, and it was just really a wreck. And people were going to make a bonfire out of it and watch it burn and drink a little whiskey while they were doing it, until they found out its whole history. And the Veterans for Peace group there decided in Monterey, up in Humboldt Bay, decided they wanted to restore the boat. So for the next 5 years, a volunteer effort basically rebuilt the boat. And since 2015, and it splashed down in 2015. Since 2015, Veterans for Peace has been sailing that boat, holding all kinds of events, educating people about the growing danger of nuclear war, in support of the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. We've had events up and down the west coast of North America, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, California, Baja, Mexico, where we took our deported veterans out sailing. Then we sailed all the way over to Hawaii. We actually decided we wanted to, after President Trump and Kim Jong-un were threatening each other with nuclear war, we decided we wanted to sail it back into the Pacific. We were going to go to the Marshall Islands, Guam, Okinawa, and Japan, but then COVID hit and all those countries shut down. So we were unable to do that. We ended up spending 2 years in Hawaii, visited all the different Hawaiian islands, learning about how the U.S. military installations there are poisoning the environment and destroying indigenous Hawaiian culture. And then finally, we brought the boat back to California and made a decision to sail it on the Great Loop of the Mississippi River and the Atlantic coast. So the Great Loop is a big loop of waterways that covers much of the Midwest, the South, and Eastern United States. We've been doing that for the last 6 months, and right now we actually started in Minnesota, came all the way down to Mississippi, the Ohio River, the Tombigbee, Tennessee River, into the Gulf of Mexico, Florida, and then we sailed to Cuba, and to bring our message there because, 60 years ago, there was almost a nuclear war over the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis. And really, it was over the U.S. hostile policy towards Cuba, which is trying to destroy that revolution and created a situation that almost led to nuclear war. So we make it Veterans for Peace is renewing our call for an end to the U.S. blockade of Cuba. Right now, we're sailing the boat all the way up the Atlantic coast. We're on our way today to Norfolk, Virginia, and we're soon going to be approaching Washington, D.C. and the great cities of the Northeast. We're getting a lot of exciting media coverage and support and kind of breathing new life into the nuclear abolition movement in the U.S., and we're really excited about that. If people want to know more about that, they can go to vfpgoldenrule.org, where we put daily posts on our Facebook page, which is Golden Rule Peace Boat.
Speaking of Cuba, if you can talk a little more about the economic war against Cuba going on for decades now, the economic war against Venezuela as well, has a lot of similarities, but some differences, and how economic war is still war.
Yeah, economic war is definitely war. And it's not just in a metaphorical sense, but it kills people. When you're starving people, when you're denying them necessary medicines, you're killing people. Just like, according to the United Nations, the Clinton era sanctions against Iraq prior to the U.S. invasion killed as many as 500,000 children by denying them much needed medicines. The same thing is going on in Cuba. Certainly not that kind of death rate, but it's caused great poverty and great suffering. There's no doubt about it. And even now, people in Cuba are really hurting. But they still have they've had to live, for the last 60 years with the U.S. Boot on their neck. And it's a shame because they have achieved so much. They have, free education and free healthcare and equality to a large extent. They continue to combat racism, and there's more equality and better racial relations in Cuba than you'll see almost anywhere. They've developed a wonderful medical school where they invite poor and working class students from all over the world to come to get free medical education. including some in the U.S. who've taken advantage of that. And they've actually managed to, they have quite a scientific and pharmaceutical research and industry. They've developed 6 different COVID vaccines, for example, and some other vaccines and medicines that actually could be useful to people in the United States against cancer and heart disease. But the U.S. allows no trade, no aid.
The U.S. also makes it illegal for someone in the U.S. to go to Cuba for medical care. And I remember reading about people going to Cuba to get the vaccine for, I believe it's lung cancer that they had created. And they had to go there because they couldn't get it in the U.S., and that's illegal. Right.
So it's an insane and crazy policy, and it really doesn't make any sense. And it certainly hasn't achieved. It's not achieved its goal of causing a mass uprising in Cuba that's going to overthrow the Cuban government and then make a more capitalist-friendly government there. However, it has certainly stymied the development in Cuba, and life is still pretty tough there. And it's really important. There is a growing movement. I was glad to see that the president of Mexico now is saying he wants to lead an international effort to end the blockade of Cuba. Other Latin American leaders are speaking up as well. And of course, the UN votes every year to denounce the U.S. blockade and to call for it to end. And every year there's just a few people, a few nations that vote with the U.S. This year, only one. It was like only Israel voted against this motion. The rest of the world is united, calling for the end of that blockade. But increase, so that's been on for 60 plus years. But increasingly, over the last several years, the U.S. has kind of perfected its economic warfare. And they're using it, as I said, against many countries and threatening others with it. It's about a third of the world population is affected by U.S. sanctions at this point. They've used it in Syria, of course, and then other Latin American countries that are not towing the U.S. line. Venezuela has been a target. There was a study done a few years ago that showed that in just a few years, the U.S. sanctions against Venezuela were responsible for 40,000 Venezuelan deaths. They're using, they continue to use sanctions against Nicaragua. Once again, why? Because it's a success story. They don't want a country to be able to break away from the U.S. Imperialist domination and then have a successful model to demonstrate to the world. So what we have now is just, aside from the sanctions, it's just an avalanche of lies in the media all the time about the horrible Ortega dictatorship in Nicaragua. And many of us know who've visited there repeatedly over the years that is far from the case, that Nicaragua rates as one of the happiest countries in the world, that they've reduced poverty.
The most peace-filled people, apparently, according to Gallup. This is no communist poll. According to Gallup, the most peace-filled people in the world are in Nicaragua, meaning they feel peace. Yeah.
I saw your bit on that, Lee, on one of your shows, and I know I shared that with some of our friends in Nicaragua. They found it very amusing. But yeah, so you got to go after these people. There's too much happiness down there.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
We only have 8 minutes left, but if you could speak for a minute about we're coming up on the anniversary of the Venezuelan Embassy Collective, and we also just saw a few weeks ago the U.S. essentially stole the embassy for a second time. The first time was to hand it over to Juan Guaido, the non-president of Venezuela. Now Juan Guaido is not even recognized by the opposition party, and so the U.S. essentially saying no one is president of Venezuela. And so they have stolen the embassy again and put it in U.S. hands. And yeah, you were there and you were attacked and you were imprisoned. And if you could talk a bit about this anniversary.
Yeah, that's about 4 years ago now. As a matter of fact, a number of people who participated in that, what they called Embassy Protection Action, collective action, are getting together here to celebrate next week in Washington, D.C. That was an amazing action because instead of allowing the U.S. to turn over this embassy to Juan Guaido and this fake president of Venezuela, a number of U.S. activists just moved into the embassy and occupied it in solidarity with the Venezuelan people and government, and with the approval of the Venezuelan people and government, and held on for several weeks instead of allowing it to fall into those hands. For sure, a small part in it. Veterans. I was there, president of Veterans for Peace at the time, and I led a group of VFP members who participated in that action. And then there's Kevin and Zeus.
Kevin Zeus.
Right, and Margaret.
Margaret Flowers. Yeah.
Flowers, just blocking on names here. Looks like David Paul over there. And so at any rate, we were having a little action right below the window one day. And I was standing next to Medea Benjamin, and she was holding up some food, cucumbers and stuff like that. And just symbolically, because they were trying to starve these people out. So they're making it very difficult for us to deliver food. So I grabbed one of the cucumbers and a couple cucumbers and was just holding them up symbolically. And Kevin, sitting there in the window right there, beckoned and said, "Throw it, throw it, throw it." So of course I did, and really bad throw. My first throw was like 3 or 4 feet under the window, and so I was kind of embarrassed about that. But then I was going to make a better throw, and I just wound up to throw it, and I got tackled by Secret Service police, who then threw me to the ground face first and kind of bloodied me. There's a photo of me sitting on the sidewalk there with a bloodied head, and ended up going all around the world, So brought a little bit more attention to the situation. Then I spent a night in the wonderful Washington, D.C. jail for a little bit more abuse. But it was an unplanned action, but those things do happen. And now I have more friends in Venezuela than ever before.
Yes, it was an amazing action, an amazing time for them to hold that embassy. I will always remember being right outside the building as well. Right.
I still get teased about that all the time. People are always saying, "Hey, where's your cucumber of mass destruction?"
And I remember they actually charged one of the Code Pink people for throwing bread, and they charged her with throwing a missile, was the exact definition.
Yeah, right. I think that's what I got charged with, throwing a missile too.
Jerry, it is such a pleasure to talk to you again. And, in this last minute, if you can just remind people how to take part in the protest tomorrow and how to follow Veterans for Peace.
Yes, well, tomorrow's an important day. It's a real coming together of much of the anti-war movement. As I said, over 200 groups have endorsed this action, not only in Washington, D.C., but in quite a few cities around the country, as a matter of fact, calling for an end to endless wars, calling for peace in Ukraine, calling for a ceasefire and negotiations to end the war instead of more weapons and money to prolong it. And there's a whole long list of demands from free all political prisoners, including Julian Assange, Mumia Abu-Jamal, and many others. We are also calling for an end to the war on Black America. We want peace at home. We want peace abroad. People who are looking for this should go to answercoalition.org or to UNAC Peace. That's the United National Anti-War Coalition, unacpeace.org. Or you can find out information about the Veterans and GI contingent at veteransforpeace.org. And, we're always looking for more veterans to join us, veterans of all ages, sizes, colors, and genders are very, very welcome in Veterans for Peace. And we even have some places for non-veteran associate members of Veterans for Peace. So check us out at veteransforpeace.org and keep on waging peace.
Thank you so much, Jerry. I hope tomorrow goes amazing. I wish I could be there. It just didn't work out, but I hope it's incredible, and I hope to see you in person again in not long.
You'll be there in spirit for sure, Lee. Thanks so much. It's always great to see you.
Keep fighting. Talk to you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, there is Jerry Condon, a legend in the anti-war movement, and obviously talking about such important issues. Thank you so much for joining me. This will be on replay. You can watch it anytime at youtube.com/behindtheheadlines. There's many other great guests there that you might have missed out on, so check that out. Stella Assange, John Shipton, Julian Assange's father. There's Scott Ritter. There's Richard Wolff, Chris Hedges, Margaret Kimberly. So many great guests over at youtube.com/behindtheheadlines. And check those out anytime you have a few minutes and you want to listen. But we also are completely supported by you. You make this show possible. So if you want to support Behind the Headlines and Mint Press, all the great work that is done there, go to patreon.com/behindtheheadlines. And I will see you. Actually, I have an interview tomorrow with one of the hosts of Revolutionary Blackout News. So join me there. Keep fighting.